Thank you so much for inviting me to kind of speak to you about behavior design and, kind of share my experiences with that plus user experience. If you can see my screen, I will kind of go through my quick bio before I turn off the webcam. Since everyone has introduced themselves, I'll just do a really quick kind of intro of me. I'm the owner of AgencyUX. As Ron mentioned, I'm based out of San Francisco Bay Area. I've been designing digital experiences for over 20 years, so back when the internet was much younger. During that time, I've worked for a lot of different startups, Fortune 500 companies in different capacities, so I have a lot of stories, I guess. I worked on a lot of different crazy projects, ranging from trying to design augmented reality marathons that span the country to interactive, stages and concerts like at South by Southwest, to kind of more nuts and bolts design of like e-commerce websites and also game design. I'm pretty passionate about research and design and how the two are kind of like meshed together and can help one another. And that's actually what kind of led me to behavior design some years ago. And with the idea of like with UX and the internet and everything, technology, it's like you have to stay kind of on the forefront of where the current thinking is. And I feel like behavior design is one of those new cusps. And so like learning about it, even if you kind of read some books here or there, we're kind of kindred spirits. I'm also an introvert, so I'm not going to answer any questions about my bio or anything. And I'm going to turn off the webcam and get off the screen and kind of get into the meat of the presentation. All right. So hopefully you can still see my screen, and we can kind of get into the deck. So first of all, how do you define success? I think that's a question that every project, every company struggles with, right? And for a lot of my clients, this is what I hear. I hear them, kind of give me a new project, and they say, well, it's really about increasing purchases on the website, or we just want to get views of these videos, or they want to click stuff, or they want customers to do likes and shares on social media. Whatever it is, this is the common vernacular of success, at least in terms of digital products. So when designers hear these goals, we immediately start thinking about ways to achieve it. And that's just kind of the way we work, right? So if someone is saying, yep, I have a website, I want to increase purchases, we immediately think about, okay, well, what are their products? Like, how do I present packages? Are there tiers? What kind of pricing strategy should I have? Should it be huge on the page? Like buttons everywhere. If someone has a content-based, website or app, and they want to get more and more views, then we kind of think about design patterns that we've seen. The goal was getting views. We, might think about design patterns that we've seen. Facebook kind of, when we watch one video, there's like another one, right in line that's ready to play. There's binge watching behavior that's sort of encouraged on Netflix. So there's a lot of kind of different sparks that are sort of triggered by these goals and a lot of different ways to execute them. And that's okay. We are, by nature, natural problem solvers. That is just the way our brains work, right? Whenever we see kind of like a blank or some sort of challenge or some sort of request, we naturally want to fill that in. We want to see a pattern. We want to come up with a solution. And we don't want to go against our nature there, but we just need to acknowledge that. So what if we think about success differently? Instead of triggering all those different design patterns or initial sort of design ideas, what if we recognize that all of the success metrics that our clients really want us to achieve, the ones that really matter, all boil down to human behavior? Whether it's a purchase, a view, a click, that is really kind of translating to someone actually doing those things. Even brand awareness. I've worked with a lot of companies that are like rebranding, doing national campaigns and so forth, and they want to have like digital projects where it's like, oh, it's just about brand awareness. We just want people to think about, company X in a different way. Even those always boil down to some sort of human behavior, whether it's watching a video, sharing it, or so forth. And before I go any further, let's define behavior. It's one of those words that we all think we know what it means, and then when you ask like a room full of people, everyone has a different definition. I think BJ Fogg from Stanford has a really great working definition of it. He says that behavior is a type of person doing an action in a specific context. And I love this because it is so specific. So the person that works for a certain company, in their cubicle, checking their email, that is a behavior. And if we start thinking in these terms, that allows us to hypothesize a little bit. If we frame success, all those clicks and views and so forth, if we frame those as customer behaviors, that allows us to apply consistent methods to design for them. That kind of brings us to behavior design. A definition of that is that behavior design is an approach to design focused on getting actions to take place, period. That is behavior design's sweet spot. It's all about all you need to do with the design is get someone to do something. It deals with motivation, ability, triggers or cues, choice and how we present them to people, and behavioral sciences. Before I get too deep in the theory of behavior design and the mechanics of how it works, I just wanted to tell you a quick little story about two hungry people. So here's the setting. It's dinner time, and a couple were hangry, which I guess is a level up from hungry. And there were no restaurants around. They're in a different city. So immediately, what do? They launch their food apps on their phones to find a place to eat. He finds a restaurant and he says, hey, here's a restaurant. It's only half a mile away. It happens to be a Michael Mina restaurant. Pretty well-known name. She replies, Michael Mina? Isn't that the Michelin star restaurant? That's too expensive. And by association of that name, what fills her head is a scene of like a really posh restaurant, perhaps a little stifling, maybe not what she's in the mood for. She uses her app. She says, oh, I got it. This one's pretty close, not too pricey. If you look at what she found a vegetarian restaurant, just a picture of a salad there, very healthy. Some of the review or insights here, vegetarians go nuts for this spot. What does he think? I don't know if I trust all these reviews. And immediately his mind goes to some lettuce patch where there's like no flavor, just nutrition maybe. And then she comes up with another one. She says, oh, okay, how about this place? It's not that far, it's moderately priced. We start sharing the photos of the food at the place, and it looks delicious. And so he immediately says, yes, let's eat there. What's conjured up are images from his last Indian food kind of feast, where it was really satisfying. Okay, that's the end of the story. When asked how they decided on where to eat, they said something like this. They said, it was a process of elimination. We picked the best place with good food that wasn't too far away or too expensive. Well, they were wrong, or at least not totally right, and I'll explain. The deal is that we like to tell ourselves stories about why we make decisions and behave the way we do. These stories fit our idea of who we are. And if there's anyone that doesn't know who this action tutor is on the screen, It's Spock from Star Trek, and he's a character on the show who is just ruled by logic, almost devoid of emotion, unless it's an extreme circumstance. And it's who we like to think we are a lot of the times. And so from the Spock perspective, picking the restaurant was completely logical. You know, when they looked at that Michelin star restaurant, you know, one pro was like, hey, it's close by, but they shut it down because it was too expensive. When they looked at the vegetarian restaurant, hey, it's a healthy option. Oh, it shut down because, you know, he's not vegan. And then the Indian restaurant seemed like just a great balance between all the different factors that they were weighing. But the truth is that we're actually more like Captain Kirk than we care to admit. We're largely driven by our motivations, desires, and impulses. And if you're new to Star Trek or unfamiliar with it, this is the captain of the Enterprise, and he is always kind of, you know, bursting into the scene, saving the day, and he is definitely, you know, the epitome of kind of being ruled by, you know, the desired motivation. So from his perspective, they were hangry, right? That's, again, a level up than what we normally experience. They're impatient, and they're in the mood to indulge, even if they don't say it. So when they looked at the Michael Minnow place, you know, one reason to bring it up was like, you know what, I'm starving, I need to eat now. I have this need. But it was shut down because, quite frankly, someone's cheap, or they didn't have the budget. When they looked at the vegetarian restaurant, there's identity that comes into play. Now someone says, well, I'm healthy. I'm a healthy person. I would totally eat here. The other person, well, I'm not. I would not eat there. And of course, they did achieve consensus on the Indian restaurant because it looks delicious. And I think, you know, this is a simplistic story, but I think it's something that we can all relate to. You know, if you've ever been grocery shopping when you're hungry, you know, when you kind of roam the aisles, we realize that we don't always make the best decisions when we're hungry, but we just can't seem to help ourselves in the moment. And that's what happened here. So what does this mean? This means that we all have an inner Spock and Kirk driving every decision and behavior we do every day. And as creators, we need to recognize this and design accordingly. So I want to talk about UX very briefly. While it is holistic in nature, just by definition, it's still a very left-brain biased discipline. And it's not a bad thing. You know, its roots are in cognitive psychology and human factors, really kind of analyzing people almost in terms of them as machines. You know, how does short-term memory work, whether it's capacities? How does attention work, and so forth. It assumes that people are rational and that if you just tell them enough information, that they will make the best decision for themselves, you know, kind of weighing the pros and cons. And I love UX. You know, it's wonderful for building really usable, robust platforms that facilitate interaction. On the other hand, we have behavior design. It's very right-brain biased. It's grounded in behavioral economics and psychology. It understands that we're driven by our biases and sometimes acts irrationally. So behavior design is really great for persuasion and getting people to take action. So it's been said, and I do agree, that in theory, user experience design and behavior design are actually the same. You know, they both describe different approaches to creating experiences and achieving outcomes. That is what we all want at the end of the day. But in practice, there's some differences. And after doing this for some years, it's become really, really clear to me that user experience and behavior design are two distinct disciplines that work together like two sides of our brains. UX providing that logical platform, and behavior design providing the persuasion. So, as I think I mentioned before, but I had the great opportunity to study with B.J. Fogg of Stanford, and he's really a pioneer in the behavior design space. And he's come up with this really great and simple model for behavior called B.J. Fogg's behavior model. And that simply states that behavior happens when three things come together, and that's represented in this equation. The M represents motivation. So someone already has to want to do the behavior to begin with. The A stands for ability. The person has to have the capacity to do the behavior. And the T stands for trigger or cue. And that is the fact that the person has to be prompted to do the behavior. So this behavior model can actually be expressed graphically. So this is where, if I had a whiteboard, I would be drawing this out. But if we kind of plot X and Y axes here, and on the Y-axis, we plot motivation. So at the top, someone is very highly motivated, and then there's like a continuum down to the bottom where someone has very low motivation. And on the X-axis, we have ability. So on the right-hand side, something super easy to do, and on the left-hand side, it's very difficult, very hard to do. And then we have what's called the action line, which I'll get into in a little bit minute, and it'll be super clear then. But as a placeholder, that's where it goes. So let's kind of think back to the Indian restaurant. You know, the couple that's kind of going back and forth about where to eat. So the Indian restaurant, you know, represented something that they both had high motivation for. You know, the photos, you know, in the app, they just looked delicious. It kind of keyed into some old memories that they may have had. But in the moment, the motivation was very high. They're probably salivating. If we also look at their ability, you know, it was cheap. It wasn't too far. So if we trigger them, and let's say in this example, the trigger is within the app itself, there's a button to map directions to the restaurant. So which is the kind of logical next step. So because they're highly motivated and it's easy to do, when they're triggered, that behavior is going to happen. And it did. Let's just contrast that with the Michelin star restaurant, if you will. So motivation may have been high overall because, you know, it was very close by. They're hangry. You know, it's kind of like they're going to get their food maybe fast, or at least maybe some breadsticks, who knows. And it being a Michelin star, it's probably pretty delicious too. So, you know, there is high motivation for it. But when we talk about ability, it's probably really expensive. I don't know the exact prices, but, you know, a couple going there with drinks would probably spend $200 or $300. So given that reality, when triggered, looking at that page, are they going to click map directions? No, that behavior is actually not going to happen. And then just to kind of round this out, if we talk about that vegetarian restaurant that was cheap, so, you know, ability was easy for them to do, they could afford it. It was pretty close by as well. But motivation was also pretty low. At least, you know, between the two of them, you know, there was the fear that it was bland or boring, you know, just not what they were into at the time. And so when triggered, that behavior did not happen. So if you look at this graph, there is that action line that I mentioned earlier, which is the arc. And it represents the threshold above which, when triggered, the behavior will happen. If you have other, you know, restaurants in this scenario where either it's too hard to get to, it's too far, too expensive, or the motivation isn't high enough, it's just not the kind of food that they're looking for, you can come up with all the bells and whistles about how to trigger them 10 times, a minute, if you will. That behavior will simply not happen. And a lot of the work that we do as behavior designers is focused on getting behaviors to happen, of course. So on this top portion, some things that we do are just make it easier for the person to do the behavior, thereby increasing their ability. That would move it over the threshold line and make the behavior happen. Alternately, on the bottom, where something is easy to do, but they just lack motivation, we also try different ways to increase motivation and get it over the threshold line and get that behavior to take place. So now, I know everyone has kind of different backgrounds, but I'm sure we all have a project that we're working on or a new idea for something. So I want you to just kind of visualize it for yourself. Think of a behavior that you want your customers to do. And I'll give you some tips for picking the good behaviors. So number one, pick something that you can trigger. So if we were kind of the owner of that food app, for example, behavior after you're looking at a restaurant page, to click on a button to get driving directions is great. It's definitely within the realm of possibilities. It may not be as realistic, but on the flip side, if we own this app and we said, hey, we want you to review the restaurant ahead of time before you even eat there, that's not a good behavior to choose for obvious reasons, but also because people are not motivated to do it and they will lack the ability to do it. Sure, they can type on the phone, right away, but they won't have anything to say. The second tip would be the smaller and more specific the behavior, the better. So in this case, clicking on a button to get driving directions, wonderful. The app shouldn't kind of go crazy with asking you to come up with a new feature or ask their customers to do a behavior, which is make a week's worth of reservations on Monday. That's just, it's asking too much. And usually when we think about behaviors, such as, I just throw an example, like going to the gym, people have sometimes articulate behaviors like, oh, I want to work out more, or I want to be healthier. They're actually really abstract. And when you kind of break it down and say like, well, what are the small steps that need to happen in order to achieve that more, kind of lofty goal? What you'll find is that you can usually break things down, right? So even in terms of putting your shoes by the door, putting your socks out and your shorts out the night before, these are all kind of like small steps that can lead to that success of being a healthier person. Thirdly, we want to choose something that's really good for the customer. If we own the food app, we shouldn't be pushing advertisers ahead of sort of like the natural search results, unless it's super transparent that we do that, just because that can kind of result in backlash and, it's not really meeting the customer's expectation. And the last tip here is don't think about design. And as I said, it's human nature to kind of like, oh, if I see a problem, I'm just naturally going to start thinking about ways to solve it or possibilities about what I can do to solve it. This step of the phase is really thinking about like, what is the behavior devoid of any kind of prototype or design or stimuli or anything like that. It's just what do we want people to do, and keep it that simple. Okay, next. Next is developing an understanding of customer motivation. And this is something that's, done through research, and there are just a few points about it that I want to call out because it's so important. Firstly, it's the hardest part of the equation to affect. If we think about that, behavior happens when motivation, ability, and a trigger come together. Motivation is ironically the first thing that people think about affecting. You know, they say like, oh, if people are coming to my website and they're not buying, they're just not motivated. You know, I get to do something to amp that up and, you know, and get them to do that purchase behavior. But really, it's like people are so unique, and, you know, as we'll see in the next points, motivation can be a bit of a fickle thing, that it's actually far easier to work on designing the trigger and working on ability, which we'll see next. The second tip for motivation is that it does change from moment to moment. And even like within a given day, like you wake up in the morning, if you've had a good night's sleep and a positive attitude, like you wake up and you feel kind of like refreshed, and you've kind of got like this store of like willpower and energy, and, you know, it's much easier to do the things that you should be doing. And contrast that with like later in the day, after you've worked, you know, a full day and you've had to deal with, you know, like your inbox, and some family stuff or whatever. What you're capable of doing behavior-wise is actually far less. And then the third one here is you can potentially leverage external events. So, you know, right now if you go shopping, you're going to see all this stuff like, hey, it's back to school, but there's also other like holidays, like New Year's. That is just like, that's almost a given of like, hey, in the new year, what are you going to do differently? What behaviors will you change in your personal life? Even just hitting your alarm clock and waking up and getting out of bed. That's an example of an external event that you can leverage and kind of understand how motivation is high or low or a little bit different. Okay, next we'll want to check if a customer has the ability to do the behavior. And there are certain ways that we can actually boost that ability if we kind of figure like, you know what, no, this is kind of beyond them, you know, right now. And so one way to boost ability is to really create the right conditions. And if I were to make a parallel with that food app again, you know, knowing that we want the behavior of people actually making their way, you know, finding a restaurant and getting directions to go there. When the app loads, we really want to bias what we show people to be focused on search and openness and basically exploration, versus what I find is a very common sort of impulse of companies is to basically push information and kind of put stuff in the user's way to make sure they see it, I suppose, and kind of force them to do a bit of work. Second way to boost it is to give them some help. So, you know, one way to do that is to give them some tools. In the app, like a very simple, you know, interpretation of a tool is a default in your sorting order of search results. So having your list automatically, you know, filter the restaurants by proximity, that's a help. That increases someone's ability to find the restaurant that's right for them and to get directions. And lastly, we can also just make it easier to do. You know, we don't want to include like too many steps for people. We don't want to clutter the screens too much and involve too much, you know, kind of like cognitive overload for them. And then we get to designing the trigger. So this is the last part of the equation here. And when we think about the trigger, we want to make sure that we're triggering effectively, right? Because it's one thing to think that you're triggering and the behavior's not happening, and then you try to like tweak all these other things. You really want to kind of, number one, get the psychology down right. You want to get that down first. And that's the first kind of point on this. It's design for the psychology. And then really, with behavior design, at this step in the process, it's really a focus on psychology, and that will lead to the behavior. It's binary. It either happens or it doesn't happen. And you only want to design enough to get you that answer. So kind of like in UX, where we will develop some wireframes or sketches of interfaces and, you know, basically do it in kind of a low fidelity, because, you know, that is the fidelity of the questions that we want to ask. We want to apply that to behavior design as well. So, if we were testing out the psychology of like, is it really the food images that is really going to tip someone's motivation, over and get it high enough that they are going to want to go to a given restaurant, then really, that's really what the limit of our design should be. It should be a page with some images, a couple buttons, and you don't need to do a whole lot more than that. And by keeping it simple, we can also do it really quickly and go through multiple reps. The second one is timing. If we own a food app, we know what time it is. So are we going to trigger people by sending a notification if it's, maybe it's dinner time or lunchtime or breakfast, or we know something about, their habits that sort of make our trigger more effective than it would otherwise be if we weren't paying attention to timing. And third is context. So, do we know the person is in their their home city where they want to just go to their favorite hotspot? Or are they traveling out of their area and we haven't been in this GPS location before, and maybe they need more guidance, and maybe the app can be a little more speak to that, when it triggers them. So the last piece of the kind of behavior design process or puzzle here is the idea that we definitely need to test and iterate the psychology. I mentioned it before, but if after prototyping something, that behavior isn't happening, we can start troubleshooting. And if we think back to that graphical behavior model with the axes of motivation against the axes of ability, that provides us with a really great visual of the situation. We can kind of graph out like where we think we are in that, and if we need to now try amping up motivation, or if we need to try increasing somebody's ability. It's not just a kind of shot in the dark, if you will, with the results of the test. So now I'm gonna lighten up my screen, I guess, but talk about a few tools of the trade. I'm sure you have seen some of these, but I think it's also just helpful to kind of, look at examples of behavior design, sort of the tactics out in the wild. So the first one is social proof. So social proof definition, thank you, Wikipedia, is people assume the actions of others in an attempt to reflect the correct behavior in a given situation. So basically, we always look to kind of what other people have done to sort of guide what we ought to be doing or what we think we ought to be doing. So we have a couple screenshots here. The one on the left, screenshot from YouTube, looking for videos on how to draw. So, here we see, cool, we've got this sponsored video. It has 1.4 million views, which just kind of blows me away. And the second one has 861,000 views, which is an incredible amount. And then, whoa, the last one, it has 3.8 million views on how to draw a realistic face. That's pretty incredible. So, after looking at those sort of like those stats about like what other people have done, it nudges the person to view that third video, or at least kind of earmark it mentally to kind of view it in your queue. If we look over on the screenshot on the right, here's a snapshot from Amazon's page, and here we see their use of ratings and reviews, which I'm sure we've all kind of used and valued. So here we see, for the first item in the set, 4 out of 5 stars, 997 people have actually voted on that and reviewed it, which is pretty amazing. The amount of items it has in it, wow. And then Amazon kind of goes the extra mile. The title for this module is called "Customers Who Viewed This Item Also Viewed." So when a user reads this, they're like, "Wow, okay." Not only is it sort of giving that stamp of approval with 997 other people, but those people are kind of like me. they're part of my tribe. Another tool is scarcity. So when an object or resource is less readily available, like due to limited quantity or time, we tend to perceive it as more valuable. So thank you, behavioraleconomics.com. So we have a screenshot on the left. This is a website called, I think it's called Wayfair. Outdoor patio sets. Oh my gosh, it's 76% off. It's normally $2,700, but it's on sale for $656, which is amazing. And whoa, the sale is actually going to end in one day. I think there was like 5.5 hours left. So that sense of urgency really kind of keys into that idea of scarcity. So there could be other patio sets of equal value without that timer, but because of that, this one gets that nudge. On the right-hand side, screenshot from Zappos, added some shoes to my cart. Whoa, only one left. And they go the extra mile by telling me, this item may become unavailable if someone else purchases it. So not only is it scarce, it's bringing up the idea of competition and the idea that someone else who could be doing the same item might get it from me. So definitely increasing scarcity and the kind of desire to buy it. So reciprocity is another tool that we can use, and that is a social norm that involves in-kind exchange between people responding to others' actions with an equivalent action. And I think, we see this every day, right? Like you meet someone, maybe someone you haven't met before, you extend your hand for a handshake, they extend their hand, your hands meet in the middle, and it's sort of this very equitable kind of greeting, right? So the screenshot of LinkedIn on the left kind of shows me that, well, so-and-so invited me to connect 6 days ago. Someone went through the trouble of looking at my profile or finding me on some sort of list on LinkedIn and thought I was interesting enough that they wanted to reach out and connect with me. I mean, what kind of a jerk would I be if I just didn't accept their invitation, right? That idea of reciprocity there is like, well, am I just going to snub them? No, I'm not a rude person, so that I haven't, actually accepted yet, but I'm leaning towards it. And then we have the screenshot on the right. We've probably all seen this. We visit a website, something pops up, and it says, hey, hey, get this thing for free, if you just give us your email address. They've obviously created something that, maybe I think is valuable. It's a plant-based protein grocery list, which, maybe that's interesting. They obviously gone through all the hard effort to create this thing. It's probably worth my time to look at. Sure, in exchange, I'll give them my email address. I'm much more likely to do that than if a pop-up just showed up that said, hey, we have great information, just give us your email address. So, and the last tool that I want to cover is anchoring. And basically a definition here is that anchoring basically uses the first exposure to information as a reference point when subsequent evaluations are made. And the crazy thing is that even if there's no relationship between what you first saw and those subsequent items. So I am not an audiophile, but I love headphones, and I fully admit to being suckered into buying almost $200 headphones from the Apple Store one time. And I like them and I use them, so it's like that was fair. But when I was shopping for in-ear headphones, I was like, okay, well, gosh, those were super nice headphones. I think my maximum that I would spend is $200, and still, that's a lot of money, if you think about it. So I was shopping on the website and I found, this product page where, okay, this manufacturer makes all these different types of in-ear headphones, and the first item costs $999. The normal price is $1,300, which blew me away. I'm like, oh my gosh. As my eye kind of goes down to the other tiles, I'm like, okay, well, something's $24. That's super cheap. Oh, okay, then this one is $319, and that last one is $119. Those last ones actually don't seem that expensive when I think about it. especially with that anchoring effect of the $1,000 product. So there are many, many more behavioral principles. There's stuff being created every day with new research. But I think the thing to keep in mind with all these tactics, right, like scarcity and social proof and so forth, is that we really have to think about these things as ingredients. They're not a complete system for us to implement behavior design. Behavior design, if we think about the fog model with behavior happens when motivation, ability, and a trigger all come together, and we've seen that graph, that really kind of offers us more of kind of a recipe and more of a way to troubleshoot behaviors if they're not happening. I think we've seen it with user experience as well, where if a given company makes their website quote user-friendly, they'll just make a page with less stuff on it, where the button is super prominent. And while yes, that may help with a few people and it may be a little more usable, it's not really doing the user experience design. So that's just something to keep in mind with this. And we're in the home stretch. Just a couple more thoughts to share. One is that you can only get people to do what they already want them to do. You can't totally fabricate motivation for a person. Behavior design is not a magic pill that will make that happen. And as I said before, motivation is ironically the very hardest thing to change. So consider this as you design. And as you create your own products, services, and experiences, integrating behavior design, please encourage people to do good things or suffer the backlash, not from me, but from them. And we've all heard those stories about, the people's kids going crazy with in-app purchases that they thought were, using free apps. There's definitely backlash that shows up in social opinion, loss of customers, and potentially even lawsuits. So there's a lot of talk about ethical design these days, which I'm 100% behind. So I think as designers, we need to really think about design for the long run and the good of our customers. Cool, so that's all I have. So thank you very much for kind of listening to this, and I hope it was something new for some of you, and that it sparked some interest in behavior design.